Hey kids, welcome back to Rob's Guide to Hearts of Iron 3. This episode we are going to be talking about leaders, or generals, and where to assign them in the hierarchy and sort of how they work, the mechanics of them. Before we get into that, I just want to mention that I have started a Twitch channel, and I will be playing Hearts of Iron 3 on that channel. So the channel name is rob_spot. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check out that channel, follow it, and you can watch me play the game. I'll be available to answer questions about the game on that channel as well. So let's dive in. Leaders in Hearts of Iron 3 are really interesting because you can choose your leaders all the way down to the divisional level. I think in Hearts of Iron 4, it stops at the core level. So there's a lot of micromanaging potential, some of which is necessary, and sometimes you can not pay too much attention to it, especially at the divisional level. But it is an interesting mechanic in the game. So there are four basic attributes that leaders have in Hearts of Iron 3. There's the leader's rank, there is the leader's skill, there is the leader's experience, and there are the leader's traits. The rank, in terms of the land leaders, rank really only determines where in the hierarchy you can place the leaders. So you can place the 4-star field marshals at the theater or army group level, the 3-star generals at the army level, the 2-star generals will go at the corps level, and the 1-star generals, the major generals, will go at the divisional level. For air leaders, rank has a slightly different function. 1-star air leaders can command 4 air wings, 2-star leaders can command 8 air wings, 3-star leaders can command 12 air wings, and 4-star leaders can command 16 air wings. So if you have too many wings in your stack, or too many units in your stack, you will get a penalty. In terms of naval leaders, 1-star admirals can command 6 ships, 2-star admirals can command 12 ships, 3-star admirals can command 18 ships, and 4-star admirals can command 30 ships. Otherwise, you'll get a penalty. So next up, we're going to talk about leader's skill. You can see that this field marshal has a skill level of 3, for example. For land leaders, skill gives you a bonus during combat, so you get basically a flat bonus that's multiplied by the skill. And the other thing that land leader's skill does is it increases the chance of certain combat tactics being used. So we'll talk more about combat tactics next episode, which is going to be the episode on land combat. But suffice to say that higher skilled leaders are more likely to use more advanced tactics, which will give a number of bonuses during combat. So skill is very, very important. The other thing that skill does is it multiplies the bonus given at various levels of the order of battle. So just a quick recap of those bonuses. At the theater level, you get a bonus to you get a stacking penalty reduction. At the army group level, you get a reduction in supply consumption. At the army level, you get a combat efficiency bonus, which is basically a flat percentage combat modifier. And at the corps level, you get a reinforcement chance bonus, which is a very good bonus as well. So that bonus is going to be multiplied by the skill of the leader, and so that's why skill is probably almost the most important attribute that a leader has, that and also the traits. For air leaders, skill simply gives a bonus during combat, just like it does for land leaders. For naval leaders, skill actually gives a positioning bonus. So we can see that Fraser here is a level 5 admiral, and he gives a positioning bonus of 50%. Backhouse, on the other hand, is a level 2 general, and so he gives a positioning bonus of 20%. It's very important to use use your high-skilled admirals to get them as high skill as possible early on. That will allow you to field larger fleets without having a positioning penalty from going over your hull size limit. Leaders also have a max skill level. The max skill level is basically predetermined at the start of the game. If you go on the wiki, you can look at the max skill here for each different country. Generally, you could make a note of which leaders have the highest max skill if you wanted to. I almost categorize that as sort of cheating in a certain sense. It's not something that the game reveals to you while you're playing, but you can certainly do that. Generally speaking, though, the leaders that start with a higher skill will tend to have a higher max skill. You can see, for example, that here's a skill 1 air leader that has a max skill of 8, so that's pretty good. And then you can see down here, there's a skill 5 leader that only has a max skill of 7. There are some leaders that it might not be worth investing in if you really want to go through this list and make notes. But generally speaking, you're not going to need to know the max skill of your leaders. When a leader hits max skill, you'll see in brackets max beside the skill number, and all that means is that they're going to gain experience slower. So if the max skill of Alexander is 6. Once he hits 6, his experience will go up slower, but it's not actually a hard maximum in the sense that they can still gain new skill points all the way up to skill 10, I believe. If you look in terms of leader experience is basically a progress bar towards the next skill level. So Alexander here, if he gets 100% experience, he'll go up to skill 6, and the experience will revert down back to 0%. So what that means is that it's the skill that's important in terms of winning battles, not the experience. One thing you should know about experience, though, is how it's gained. So experience for all 3 types of leaders, land, air, and navy, are gained based on time in combat. So for divisions, for land divisions, this basically means that the divisions that fight the most are going to gain experience faster. So typically, I tend to find that armored divisions, motorized divisions, anything that moves fast tends to be in combat more often. Obviously, infantry divisions that are defending a choke point or a particularly difficult province to take. If you're playing as the Soviet Union, for example, and you stack a bunch of divisions in a fortress, in a sort of a fortress city, or in a very difficult terrain type, those divisions might gain experience faster. Marines also tend to gain a lot of experience because if they land and they're opposed by a number of divisions, it takes them quite some time. It can take them, many hours to actually establish a beachhead, and all of those hours count as combat time. Also, Marines tend to get pinned down once they've landed if you don't reinforce them quickly. So there are certain kinds of divisions that are likely going to gain experience for their leaders a lot faster. For air units, because of the way air combat works, and I'll talk more about this on the air combat video, basically fighters tend to spend less time in combat than bombers. What happens in air combat between fighters is that either your stack or the enemy's stack will get down to a certain point of organization and then flee, after which point the battle will end. Whereas bombers tend to gain experience faster because, generally speaking, unless they get totally shredded, they will complete their bombing mission. Typically, if you want to train up and sort of groom air leaders for more important commands, you're going to want to put them on bombing missions rather than fighter missions. For naval leaders, when large fleets enter combat, if you have the naval advantage, the combat will tend to be actually fairly brief. So fairly few hours spent in combat, because the enemy fleets will typically, as soon as they start to lose their org and they're hit with an overwhelming force, they'll tend to run away. The fastest way to gain naval experience is actually combat raiding, because small squadrons of submarines or other convoy raiders will provided you're fighting an enemy that has a lot of convoys, will be constantly sinking convoys until they get intercepted. So they'll be able to get a little bit more combat experience. Naval battles tend to be short and decisive in this game. So you're going to want to put a handful of really good leaders on your large fleets, and have a small handful of leaders fight the majority of your battles. Let's take a look at land leader traits now. The easiest way for us to do this is going to be actually to look at the filters here. This is a really useful tool, by the way. If you're sorting through your leaders, you can deselect certain traits and reselect them, and you can get rid of the guys with no traits. You can isolate your old guards. Looking at the different traits, old guard is the only negative trait. Old guard exists for land, naval, and air. It's the only negative trait, and it slows down the experience gain of leaders. Any of the traits that are in gray are traits that don't pass down to the lower levels of the hierarchy. So thankfully, old guard is only going to affect that actual HQ or division in terms of the leader's experience gain. So generally speaking, you're going to want to avoid using old guards, and there's certain situations where you can sort of use them up to not have them in your order of battle. One thing I like to do is I like to once I've selected all of my leaders and put any of the old guards in the field that I actually want in the fields, I actually tend to I tend to isolate all my old guard leaders like this, and I tend to promote them all to at least core level, and that I do that so that if I have auto assign turned on, they don't get assigned to the division, because I don't really mind if an old guard gets assigned to the core level as much as I mind having an old guard on at the divisional level, because they're not going to gain experience very quickly, and a lot of them are low skilled, so I don't particularly want low skilled leaders that are not going to have a lot of growth potential at the divisional level. Let's look at the other land traits though, the kind of more functional ones. So I would divide the land traits into 3 broad categories. The first category is your combat traits, and this is the most important category, and in that category I would include offensive doctrine, defensive doctrine, battle master, and trickster. All of these traits give bonuses, give sort of very, very direct bonuses to combat. Offensive doctrine gives you an offensive bonus when you're the attacker. You get a defensive bonus from defensive doctrine, so when you're the defender. Battle master gives you a percentage increase on the combined arms of your divisions. Just to remind you, combined arms is based on the variety of support units that your division has. So this is a fairly standard armored division, and it has a 15% combined arms bonus. If I were to throw in, say, an SP artillery or something, then I would get up to 20%, plus multiplied by 110% from a battle master leader. So you're going to get a little. You're going to want to use your battle master leaders on the units that already have a high combined arms bonus. The standard infantry division, for example, has 5% combined arms. The fourth and final combat traits I would consider, well, these are just my categories, but I would consider the trickster. Trickster gives you a plus 10% surprise chance. Surprise occurs in the first phases of battle, and there's always sort of a dice roll as to whether you surprise the enemy, and it's a fairly substantial bonus. So the little increase in terms of the surprise chance is not a bad trait. It is a gray trait, so it does not pass down to lower orders of the order of battle, so you're going to want to use these trickster leaders at the divisional level or at the core level if you have cores that are entering combat because they have combat brigades. I like to use tricksters for armored units and motorized units, so fast moving units, because the element of surprise is more important when the units are moving quickly. Sometimes I use them for marines because the element of surprise is useful when you're doing a marine landing if you encounter some resistance. So, but generally speaking, not the most useful trait. One thing to keep in mind about the three other kind of combat traits as I'm describing them, offensive doctrine, defensive doctrine, and battle master, is that those 3 traits affect the likelihood of certain very powerful combat tactics. So, offensive doctrine increases the chance of using super blitz, which is one of the best offensive combat tactics. Defensive doctrine increases the chance of you using elastic defense or backhand blow, which are very powerful defensive tactics. And battle master increases the chance of blitz and super blitz, which once again are good offensive tactics. So something to keep in mind. Generally speaking, I would say that those 3 traits are the most powerful traits in general: offensive doctrine, defensive doctrine, and battle master, simply for that reason. The second category of trait that I want to talk about is what I would call the logistics traits, and they are logistics wizards, winter specialists, and commando. Logistics wizard is probably the most powerful of these 3. It gives a minus 25% supply consumption, which is really, really good. Very powerful at higher levels of the order of battle. Winter Specialist reduces winter attrition by 50%, which is pretty huge. If you're on the Eastern Front, then Winter Specialists, it's a very selectively useful trait, but if you use it at higher levels of the order of battle, you can vastly reduce the amount of attrition and give yourself an edge over the enemy. Commando is a little bit more selectively useful. It basically reduces the out of supply penalty. When your units run out of supply, they're going to be fighting, they're going to have a major penalty. So I actually only advise using commandos in, I would say, two circumstances. I would use them for airborne units, because airborne units, commando's not a very strong combat trait, but airborne units do tend to land behind enemy lines, and it often takes you a while to establish a supply line to them. I would advise paratroopers are not particularly strong combat units either, so you're generally using them to disrupt enemy supply lines. So you're going to drop them on a province, maybe 2 or 3 provinces back. You're actually going to avoid combat with them, and you're going to try and bring your other units to them or get an air supply route established. But so commando is going to help in that circumstance, and it maybe will give them a few more precious hours of combat time while they wait for other units to establish a supply line, and so they don't get encircled. The other unit you might want to consider using commandos for is things like motorized units that are being used for like long range exploitation, where you're driving through empty enemy territory to create an encirclement, and those units are likely to run out of fuel or supply somewhere along the road, so that might be useful as well. But don't. I would not use these even for Marines. I think Marines are better off having a much stronger combat. Marines are probably going to see more combat if you're using them right, so I would not particularly advise. No, it wouldn't be the worst trait to use for a Marine division, but I really do think these are best used for paratroopers. Another thing about logistics wizards, often when you might want to consider using commando trait, you'd be better off just using the logistics wizard trait, so that they'd be less likely to run out of supply to begin with, because your logistics wizards are going to, reduce the chance of them running out of supply. You're going to want to have this bonus for the units that consume the most supplies, or that are likely to be out of supply. So once again, motorized units and battle masters, marines, potentially paratroopers as well. The other thing about logistics wizard is that because it reduces your supply consumption, if you apply these leaders well at high levels of your order of battle, you can get your supply consumption almost to 0. So that's going to actually indirectly increase your IC. The third category of land traits are what I would call terrain traits. At the start of the campaign, there's only going to be 2 of these. It's going to be Engineer and Fortress Buster. Engineers are going to give you a plus 10% for river attack, whereas Fortress Busters are going to give you a plus 10% for fort attack. Keep in mind that almost all divisions in the game have a penalty. Almost all brigades in the game have a penalty to both fort attack and river attack, with the exception of Marines and Engineers for river attack, and with the exception of, I believe, only Engineers for fort attack. So don't think of this so much as a bonus. Think of it as a kind of mitigating bonus. It's going to mitigate the penalty. The other terrain traits: Desert Fox for desert, Swamp Fox for marsh, Mountaineer for mountains, Hill Fighter for hills, Jungle Rat for jungle, Ranger for woods and forest, and Urban Assault Specialist. There aren't any leaders that start with these traits, so they're going to be gained very, very slowly. You're not going to see a lot of these traits appear in the game. They'll appear maybe late in the campaign if you're doing a lot of fighting in one particular type of trait. So maybe Japan will see some jungle rats, or the UK if you're fighting a lot in Burma. You might get a few divisions with the Mountaineer or Hill Fighter traits, but there aren't that many mountain and hill tiles compared to the number of other tiles. And there's not really much of a way to set it up so that one leader is always fighting consistently in one terrain type. So you may see some of these appear, but I'd be quite surprised if you saw a lot of swamp foxes appear. Maybe here, for example. Maybe if you have one division that's consistently fighting in this area where there's all these marsh tiles. There just aren't that many marsh tiles in the game. Urban Assault Specialist would be the same. I mean, it's not that likely that you're going to have, unless you have a kind of Stalingrad type situation where a division is repeatedly fighting in that terrain type. So as cool as these are, they're not going to appear. They're going to be fairly rare. and they're also not that useful because, you know, if I have a mountaineer here, for example, and now I'm attacking in the mountains here, you know, what am I going to do? Move my mountaineer over here? You know, these are not going to be that useful. That's the other thing that applies to the engineer and fort buster as well. Is kind of similar in the sense that it's pretty hard. They're not as useful because you are going to be crossing a lot of rivers and attacking a fair number of forts in the game, but who's to say whether that leader will be in the right place at the right time so that they can actually make use of those traits. So they're not useless traits, and for certain there are always certain crucial battles where it might be worth it to change leaders to cross a vital river or break through a fortified line. But these are going to be much more selectively useful traits in general. So in terms of gainable traits for land traits, basically, depending on how many hours you spend in combat in different terrain types, you can gain all of the terrain-based traits, Engineer, Fortress Buster, and all these guys down here. You can also gain the Battlemaster traits, and the Battlemaster trait is a trait that you will see a lot of your leaders gaining, because any division that has any level of combined arms will slowly gain the Battlemaster trait over the course of the game. So at the beginning of the game, Battlemaster is a very valuable trait because you might not have a lot of leaders that have Battlemaster unless you're maybe Germany. Whereas late in the game, you're going to have lots of leaders with Battlemaster because they're as long as those divisions are seeing a fair amount of combat, once they get to a certain number of hours of combat, they're likely going to have Battlemaster, provided they actually have combined arms. They're not like a militia division or something like that. Moving over to air traits now. Once again, we have the Old Guard, same deal. They gain experience slower. We have one trait that is shared with the naval traits, which is the Spotter trait, which increases the chance of air units seeing ships. Very useful for naval bombers and potentially carrier air groups. In terms of the sort of combat, interceptor type traits, we've got two, Night Flyer and Superior Air Tactician. Night Flyer is a very strong trait. Night attack plus 10% is good. Generally speaking, you are going to be using your interceptors around the clock. If you have a very weak air force, you might want to avoid fighting the enemy at night at all, unless you have, say, a Night Flyer. But if you do have a decent air force and you have Night Flyers, this is great because both sides get a penalty at night. So if you have just a little bit of a mitigating bonus of that 10%, then you are going to have the upper hand. And if you think about it, night is something like 40% of the game. So you're going to have a 10% advantage over your enemy about 40% of the time. And that to me is a pretty big advantage. In terms of Superior Air Tactician, because of the way air combat works, this is sort of, it's always better to have this trait than to not have it. But if I had to choose between a level 3 Superior Air Tactician and a level 4 guy with no traits, I would probably choose the level 4 guy because this gives you an advantage to offense, and how often are you going to be on the offense? If you're on an intercept mission, you can also get intercepted while you're on the intercept mission. Certainly if you're going to be doing a lot of air superiority missions, then this is a strong trait, but it only helps you on the offense, and there's really no telling when you're going to be in the offense and the defense in the air. Certainly this is a trait that you want to use with your interceptor squadrons, but I would prioritize high skill leaders even with no trait over the Superior Air Tactician. The three other traits are basically for different types of bombing missions, and it's very important to understand that what missions these are for, and it's a little bit deceptive. So the Tank Buster one is fairly obvious. The tactical attack missions that will benefit from a Tank Buster trait are Ground Attack and Interdiction. In terms of Carpet Bomber affects all of the land targets in the game. So Strategic Bombing, Logistical Bombing, Installation Strike, Runway Cratering, and also Port Strike. And this is one thing that a lot of people don't realize, that when you're doing a port strike, you're actually using the strategic attack you're actually going to get a strategic attack bonus. So if you are using carrier air groups or naval bombers, the best leader to assign them for a port strike mission is going to be the carpet bomber, not the fleet destroyer. Fleet destroyer is going to be good for your carrier air groups and naval bombers, or any bombers that you're using, maybe even close air support that you're using to attack ships. Naval strike, convoy raiding, and the CAG duty mission, carrier air group duty mission. This will increase the amount of damage that you're doing to ships. In terms of gaining air traits, you gain superior air tactician by winning air battles. This is a very, very hard trait to gain. It's very unlikely that you're going to see a lot of leaders gain this trait over the course of the game, because planes do not spend a lot of time in combat. As I was talking with experience, they just don't spend a lot of time in combat. The victor is decided very quickly based on the organization, and one of the sides starts fleeing, so they only spend maybe 1 or 2 hours max in combat. And you actually have to win the battle to gain this trait. So are you going to win a lot of air battles? You might, in certain senses, you might come out with higher org, but the game's engine might consider that the opposing that your side fleed. So sometimes you flee before the enemy, especially if you're putting your air groups on passive stance, which is the safest way to use them. So if you want to gain this trait, you're going to have to do a lot of air superiority on aggressive stance, and your air groups are probably going to get shredded if you do that. So not a trait that you're going to gain a lot in the game. The bombing missions are a lot easier, especially Tank Buster and Carpet Bomber are particularly easy to gain. Any strategic attack mission will slowly gain Carpet Bomber based on the hours spent in combat, and Tank Buster for ground attack and interdiction. You will see a fair number of air units gaining the Tank Buster trait if you are using ground attacks a lot. In terms of naval leaders, once again we have the old guards, and then we have 4 traits. Fairly simple. Spotter is the same as it is in the air, so it increases the chance of spotting units. It's a fairly strong trait overall. It's actually in many ways one of the best traits. It will help you find fleets. It's a good trait if you have the upper hand, because you will intercept more fleets, and less fleets will be able to kind of sneak by you. So if you have a strong navy, having some spotters at a high level is good. Generally strong traits. A superior tactician basically gives you a positioning bonus, fleet concentration plus 10%, so it's also a strong trait. Generally speaking, though, in terms of these 2 traits, the most important for your large battle fleets is actually going to be the skill level, because the higher the skill level, the lower your positioning penalty is going to be, the more ships you can put in one stack, and you can basically, if you have like a level 8 Admiral, you can create this kind of unstoppable doom stack. So it's not going to matter what trait they have, it's just going to matter what skill they have. The other 2 traits, though, are fairly important. Seawolf, it's a little bit confusing. It says submarine attack plus 20%. Use Seawolves on your submarine stacks. It's going to increase the effectiveness of their convoy rating. Blockade runner is a very useful trait. It's useful in a few situations. So first of all, any ship that you don't want to be in combat, like a landing craft squadron or a transport flotilla, but also if you are a country with a weak navy like Germany, you're going to want to use your high-skilled blockade runners on your most valuable ships, because if they get attacked by a much larger enemy fleet, you're going to want them to flee faster. Disengage timer, a little bit confusing. Again, what it means is that your fleet is going to be allowed to break off from combat sooner and flee faster. So this is a very strong trait. Similar to the air units, you are able to gain superior tactician by winning naval battles. Once again, though, most countries, except for maybe the United Kingdom and the United States, or maybe Japan, are not going to fight that many naval battles. Naval battles tend to be short, they tend to be decisive, a lot of ships get sunk very quickly, so the naval outcome in most cases is decided by, you know, maybe 10 or 20 really key naval battles, rather than dozens and dozens and dozens of small battles. Fleets tend to get stacked and concentrated into big fleets fairly early in the game, so you're not going to see a lot of leaders gain this trait. The Seawolf trait, if you use a lot of submarines and you have a lot of submarine stacks on convoy rating, you may very well see a handful of leaders gain the Seawolf trait. So now I'm going to show you how to assign leaders based on their traits and skill across the order of battle. One good principle to keep in mind when you're looking at the trait bonuses, the higher up the order of battle, the less of the bonus trickles down to the divisional level for land leaders. If the divisional level, you're going to get 100% of the trait bonuses, so in this case, supply consumption, defense, and offense. When you go up to the core level, that bonus is cut in half, so in this case, you'd only be getting 50% of the minus 25% logistics wizard trait. At the army level, it's going to be cut in half again, so that's actually 25% or a quarter of this defense bonus of 10%, so you're only getting actually a defense bonus of 2.5% at the divisional level. And at the army group level, it's going to be cut in 8, so you're getting 1/8 of that 10% defense bonus. And at the theater level, it's cut into 16, so you're only going to be getting 1/16 of the minus 25% supply consumption bonus. On the other hand, this supply consumption bonus is going to be applied to divisions across your entire theater, so some of these bonuses are better at higher levels of the order of battle, and some of them are better at lower levels of the order of battle. It's a good general principle. Let's look specifically at planning an order of battle in terms of leaders. I'm using the UK as an example here because the UK has, you know, really a very diverse mix of naval units, air units. You know, I've set the UK up here with a land front in France, so you can see how to use traits across different parts of a front, different types of land units. You know, what traits or leaders are good in, say, isolated circumstances, or if you have kind of low combat level units like garrisons, for example. So it's a pretty good example, I think, a little bit more varied than the classic sort of Germany example. When you're organizing your order of battle and when you're choosing your leaders, the best time to choose your leaders is on January 1st, 1939. You're going to get new leaders every January 1st of the campaign, so in 37, 38, 39, January 1st is when you're going to get your new leaders. If you're playing a country that starts the war in September 1939, which most countries, with the exception of Italy and Japan, if you're playing historically, will start the war in 39. So I typically assign my leaders on January 1st, 1939. Obviously, if you're going to declare war earlier, then you're going to want to choose your leaders earlier, because every time you change leaders, your unit suffers an organization penalty. So you're not going to want to change units when you're in combat, or you're not going to want to change leaders on an active front. Obviously, that's a little bit less important for higher levels of the hierarchy. HQ units that are not going to enter battle, like army groups and armies, hopefully, unless you get totally overrun. It's not going to matter. It's not going to matter whether they have lower organization. The exception would be for logistics wizards. You should start assigning out all of your logistics wizards very early on, because you're going to reduce your supply consumption and increase your IC. When you start doing your leaders, my advice is to turn off auto assign and then to unassign all your leaders. Keep in mind that if you do this, there's no undo button, so you will have to assign every single leader for every division. If you don't want to micromanage your leaders, that's fine too, but this tutorial is all about how to micromanage your leaders, so we're going to do it. So I'm going to unassign all leaders. Once I've assigned all my leaders, I'll put the auto assign back on, because I don't know about you guys, but I find that I will invariably forget to assign leaders if divisions come out of the production queue, and even if you have a really bad leader in charge, that's much better than having no leader at the divisional level. So when I plan my order of battle and my leaders, I tend to start from the top down. And let's start with the theater. For this order of battle, I've created 4 theaters. The European commands, what I'm calling the European command, is actually just the sort of home command here, and also these units I have in France. The Mediterranean command covers, well, the Mediterranean, basically. Asia Command, I've actually combined the Army of India theater and the Far East theater that you start out at the beginning of the game, because I find that most of the fighting actually tends to happen in this area, so it's not worth having a separate Army of India theater unless you're going to really lose here. And Colonial Command is basically everything else. So it's actually, in this case, it's basically only troops in East Africa. I've also included the rest of the world simply because I'm not going to assign any naval leaders to this theater, and I don't want my naval units going to ports that are, if I put them on AI Command, I don't want my naval units going to ports that are, you know, not in areas where that are actually going to be sea fighting. The theater level of the order of battle gives a reduction in stacking penalty. This is a very situationally useful bonus. So having a high skilled leader at the theater level is not that important. Later in the campaign, you may end up overstacking provinces and attacking with very large forces in a single province and going over your frontage limits. And so it might be somewhat useful late in the game to have high skilled theater leaders, but certainly at the beginning of the campaign, it's just not that important. At the theater level, the best trait is probably Logistics Wizard. Another trait I would consider is the Winter Specialist, because if you have an entire theater, for example, the Eastern Front for the Soviet Union or Germany, having a high-level Winter Specialist could really make or break the winter phase of the campaign. If you are going to use a Winter Specialist, though, I would advise switching to a Logistics Wizard during the non-winter months. Generally speaking, though, you're not going to need high-level leaders, and it's not the theater level of the order battle is a level where it's perfectly fine to assign old guards. What I tend to do is I tend to pick my highest level old guard logistics wizards. If I don't have any old guard logistics wizards, I might consider using a skill 1 or skill 2 logistics wizard at the theater level of the order of battle, even though you're only getting a very small percentage. It might be 1.5, or I don't know what 25 divided by 16 is. It might be something like 1.5 or 1.65 percent supply consumption, but when applied over an entire theater with a lot of units, that's actually a pretty big bonus. Going to have a major impact on your IC. So the European command has the most units assigned to it, so I'm going to assign Brooke Popham, who is a level 3 logistics wizard old guard. So I'll get a little bit of a stacking penalty reduction, but mostly just the logistics wizard bonus. Your theater leaders are also going to gain the least experience. The higher up the hierarchy they are, they're going to gain less direct experience because they're not seeing any direct combat, so they just get a small percentage of the experience gain from all the units under them. So I'm not that worried about it being an old guard. Mediterranean command, I'll pick another skill 2 logistics wizard old guard. Same for Asia command and colonial command. And late in the game, I might consider replacing this guy with a higher skilled, a level 7 or 8 logistics wizard if I do want to field very, very large armies and attack with very large formations in one province, or a high level winter specialist. Let's take a look at the army group level now. In this order battle, I only have one army group. It's the British Expeditionary Force, which is in France. In terms of army group, it doesn't really matter much in terms of what traits your units have. It really matters in terms of skill. So because the army group field marshal gives a supply consumption reduction, it's generally not a bad idea to use a logistics wizard guy at this level of the order of battle. But if I have a choice between a skill 5 guy with no logistics wizard and a skill 4 guy with logistics wizard, I'm probably going to pick the skill 5 guy. The reason being that I can actually use my other high level logistics wizards at the army level, and they're going to get more of that bonus at the army level than they are at the army group level. So basically you want to pick your highest skill generals regardless of their traits and put them at the army group level. So in this case, I'm going to pick Alenbrook, and I'm going to reserve Alexander and Auchinleck for the army level. In terms of armies, I have 3 armies in this order of battle. I have the first army, which is kind of covering the Benelux front here. I have the second army, which is sort of a thinly spread army with 2 corps along the Maginot line. And I have the third airborne army. I talked about this in the order of battle video. I like to use airborne armies because I can drop, in this case I'm using 2 Gurkha divisions, I can drop paratroopers or airborne divisions behind enemy lines and still have them within the 400 kilometer range of the Army HQ. And then they're also going to be getting the supply bonus from the Army group level. I don't bother with core HQs because they just don't have a long enough range, and it's too easy for them to get out of range. So I'll talk about what leaders are good at the army level. Generally speaking, a leader like this that has 3 traits is very strong, even though the defensive doctrine and offensive doctrine are going to be divided. You're still getting a boost to a lot of units. The most important trait is going to be a logistics wizard. You could also use a high-skilled winter specialist in the winter, but they would probably be better at the army group or theater level because they're going to apply to more units. I would say overall, though, that the skill is still the most important trait at the army level because the army level gives a combat efficiency bonus, which is multiplied by the skill. And so having that combat efficiency bonus divided across an entire army is going to be really important. So in the case of the United Kingdom, the obvious choices are Alexander and Auchinleck. Later in the campaign, the offensive doctrine or defensive doctrine traits are going to be more important than the logistics wizard's trait. In certain situations, they're going to be more effective in terms of combat. You could also consider using a high-level battle master if you have an armored army. So an army that's entirely armored, or an army that's a mix of, say, armor and motorized units with a lot of combined arms. But that bonus is going to be pretty heavily diluted. So once again, offense, defense, and logistics wizards are going to be the strongest traits at the army level. As I mentioned before, commando is a trait that I would use for mainly for airborne units. So if you have airborne armies, and you have highly skilled commando traits, then this level 4 commando is probably going to be a decent choice for an airborne army. You could argue though that Wilson HM here might be a better choice, or even Naval. Defensive doctrine's a strong trait for airborne units because they don't tend to be very strong offensive units. You're probably going to drop them in enemy territory, and their main job is to simply hold their ground until other troops arrive. So this would be a very strong leader as well. I might want to reserve this leader for a core though, for example. So for the sake of argument, let's just pick this Mountbatten guy. It's a toss-up though. I might pick either Naval or I might pick Wilson HM. These would also be good leaders. In terms of corps, the first army here has 2 infantry corps and 2 armored corps. They're kind of stacked here so that they can be deployed as needed in Benelux. Second army has 3 corps that are very thinly spread out. I've actually put brigades in my corps. So the core HQ will be seeing combat, which is a great way to level up your leaders a lot quicker. And then I have some other corps that are kind of spread around the Empire here. So I have this Western Desert Command, which is kind of a specialized desert corps with motorized and armored car divisions. And then I have a Marine Corps attached to the British Expeditionary Force for use maybe in the North Sea, or maybe landing somewhere in the Netherlands, or perhaps defending Norway. They're attached directly to the army group level, so they're more likely to stay in range rather than attaching them to an army. I have a Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater with 5 Marine divisions. My Marine HQs don't have Marine brigades in them, but the Marine brigades are actually in the production queue, so they'll be coming out before the war starts. And finally, I actually have a garrison corps in Hong Kong. I decided to stack 3 fairly large garrison units with 4 brigades in them to try and defend Hong Kong, which I've also built up a ton of coastal forts and forts. And the corps will have the benefit of giving a reinforcement chance bonus. It's arguable whether that's useful or not, but it'll also give trait bonuses to all the units attached to it. So might have been better just to have the 3 units with no core. It's debatable one way or another, but this is definitely the sort of defensive stack core, which you can do with militia or garrisons or units like that. In urban territory, for example, militia could be useful as well. It's just another example of a type of core. So when we're picking our core leaders, we're going to start with the cores that are most likely to see the most combat first, and we're going to put our high-level leaders there so that we can train them up faster. And that's going to be our armored cores, and in this case, our marine cores. The Hong Kong Corps here might actually see a lot of combat as well. If it gets surrounded and is consistently attacked, it might see a lot of combat as well. But we'll start with our armored cores, our motorized cores, and our marine cores, because they're going to see the most combat. The faster moving units will see more combat because they're easier to move along different parts of the front. And when we're a good core leader is high skilled, because reinforcement chances is a very important bonus, and you want that bonus to be multiplied. And multi-trait leaders are very strong core leaders. So someone like Montgomery here, because those traits, you're only getting 50% of those traits, but they're being applied to 5 units. The best traits are going to be probably overall, Logistics Wizard is still a very good choice because it reduces supply, which means that the core is less likely to run out of supply. This is particularly true for armored cores and motorized cores, which consume a lot of supplies, as well as marine cores, which often end up kind of pinned down, and they're fighting to get access to a port to get supply, or they're waiting on air supply. Afterwards, the most important traits are going to be your other combat traits, so offensive doctrine and defensive doctrine. You may wish to use fortress busters or engineers or other terrain traits. If you have highly skilled leaders with those traits, you may wish to use those leaders in parts of the map where you're likely to have an entire corps of infantry, for example, trying to cross a river at once, or an entire corps of infantry focusing on attacking one fort. You might consider using Battlemaster for an armored corps as well, although your Battlemasters are still going to be the most effective at the divisional level. So for our armored corps, let's assign some high-level logistics wizards. Montgomery, it's a bit of a waste. Montgomery's Fortress Buster trait is a little bit of a waste. However, there are a lot of forts in Belgium here, and I may very well end up having to retake them with armored divisions, so I'd say Montgomery's the strongest choice for one of these armored corps. I don't particularly want to use a defensive doctrine trait on an armored corps, although it's not a bad trait, so it's a bit of a toss-up. If I'm saving this guy for another corps, then I won't use him. In this case, let's use Wilson HM, who's a level 4 logistics wizard. Now we've got our Marine Corps. For Marine Corps, I find that logistics wizard is always good because it's going to reduce their supply consumption, which means they're less likely to run out of supply. Offensive doctrine would be a strong trait, so a decent choice would be someone like Lloyd, or Cunningham, or O'Connor, or Gort. I actually like Wavell. I like defensive doctrine for Marines because they do often end up getting pinned down, and they're waiting for you to reinforce them. They might be waiting for air supply. They do tend to get kind of stranded, so it's never a bad idea to have a solid defensive doctrine trait. Because I'm going to be deploying Marine brigades in the HQ, I might also consider someone like Slim, who's going to give skill 5 reinforcement chance to all those divisions. It's going to give a supply consumption reduction to all the divisions under him, and then the division itself the HQ division itself will get the surprise chance bonus. Let's pick Wavell though for this corps. Let's look at our other Marine Corps in the Pacific. Once again, a Slim would be a good choice. I like Lloyd though, with the offensive doctrine and defensive doctrine trait. So, again, Marines are going to be involved in a lot of intense combat. So having the combination of these two traits will mean that when they're landing, if they encounter opposition, they'll have a boost to offense, and if they get pinned down, they'll have a boost to defense. For Western Desert Command here, which is my small motorized corps that's going to kind of mop up Italy and North Africa, or at the very least defend this line, good choices are going to be offensive doctrine, and logistics wizard. Trickster is also a decent trait. I do have motorized brigades and armored car in my HQ here, so maybe we'll put Slim down here. The reinforcement chance is a bit of a waste since these units will likely not be fighting in a big stack. But the logistics wizard bonus is good. It's going to mean that they're going to be able to go, to advance farther before they run out of supplies, and having the trickster trait on the HQ is not a bad idea. Also, I don't particularly want to use Slim at a higher level because then I'm not getting the surprise chance bonus at all. Once he gets to level, 8 or something, then I'm probably going to move him up to an army group level somewhere else. For Hong Kong commands, this is a very unique situation. There are fairly few situations where you're going to want to give a garrison a high-level leader, but I could give them Fitzpatrick, this level 4 defensive doctrine leader. I would never use logistics wizards for garrisons because they have a very low supply consumption to begin with. Most of the time for garrisons, I would actually advise using old guards. Finally, we can look at our general purpose infantry corps. I'm probably going to want to assign out any remaining logistics wizards for these infantry corps. They do have combat divisions though, so offensive doctrine would also be good. But the logistics wizards, the higher level logistics wizards, are going to be the most useful ones. I could consider, if I have particularly high level engineers, I don't in this case, level 2, I would not put it at core level. Or Fortress Buster. I think I only have one level 2 guy here. So that might be a good core leader with the defensive doctrine and the Fortress Buster, but I would probably still want to use him at the divisional level and wait until he's higher level before I move him to the core level. But yeah, if you had like a skill 4 engineer or Fortress Buster and you wanted to create a specialized core, then it might not be a bad idea to use them at the core level. For here though, I've got my 4 infantry corps, and I'll take these 4 skill 3 logistics wizards. Once you get down to the divisional level, there are a few. At this point, micromanaging your leaders becomes a little bit less important. You're certainly going to want to make sure that any of your mainline combat divisions don't have old guard leaders. And you're going to want to put the leaders that you want to progress the fastest, your highest skill leaders with the best traits, to your armored divisions. Also to your Marines and motorized units that are going to see the most combat should have the highest skilled leaders. If you have areas that are purely defensive, infantry areas that are purely defensive where you're not planning on attacking, then you can use your defensive doctrine leaders there. Logistics Wizard is not a particularly good trait at the divisional level, although if you have a shortage of Logistics Wizards in your army and you want to train Logistics Wizards up to a higher level, then I would consider using these leaders on armored divisions or divisions that are going to see a lot of combat, so that you can then move them higher up the hierarchy. So let's start with just like we did for corps, let's start with our armored divisions, which are likely going to see the most combat in this scenario. We can certainly take a look at our logistics wizards here and see which ones are going to be the best. So maybe Palnal, because he's got the trickster trait as well, would be a good leader here. And then maybe Percival, even though he's got the defensive doctrine traits, getting him to level 4, 5, 6 might be good because he would be a strong candidate for an armored core. Let's now assign our highest skilled Battlemaster traits. Obviously the engineer trait here would be better used on infantry, but the combination is actually quite good for armor. You should avoid doing river crossings with armor, but sometimes you don't have a choice. So someone like Hobart is actually is quite a strong tank leader. We'll take these level 2. This guy is level 3 Battlemaster, and then this level 2 guy. If I look at my offensive doctrine guys, I don't have that many good offensive doctrine leaders, and I'm going to want to save a few for my Marine corps, possibly the motorized corps that's in North Africa. I also kind of want to share these Battlemasters. Maybe put a few down here. I can click and drag and just drag a couple of decent Battlemasters down to this other armored corps. So let's grab at least one of these skill 4 offensive doctrine guys. Maybe this guy as well. And for the last divisions here, I'll just grab a logistics wizard guy. Next, let's look at some of our other specialized units. My Marine corps are actually designed to be strong jungle troops so that they can be used in the Pacific Theater later. That's why I've attached engineers to them. They would also be good at river crossing and the engineer is going to give them a dig in. It's going to speed up their dig in when if they're pinned down on beaches. So I can certainly look and see if I have any decent engineers. Although I might want to reserve this engineer for the river crossing areas here. Don't use battle masters for Marines, because Marines typically don't have any, unless they have an engineer. They're not going to have any combined arms. So they're not really going to get much of a bonus from that. Defensive Doctrine's not a bad trait, although in this case I can use my Defensive Doctrine guys for some of my important garrisons. Logistics Wizard as well, and Offensive Doctrine. So I'm probably just going to want to mix here. Maybe we'll put O'Connor. Grab a decent, grab a Logistics Wizard. Some, another Offensive Doctrine guy here. Maybe some level 2 Defensive Doctrine guys as well. Go down to the other Marine Corps down here. Kind of do a similar thing. The only garrisons I'm going to give highly skilled leaders to are these 2 garrisons in Hong Kong, because they're likely going to see a lot of combat. Even very important garrisons like my garrison in Malta or Alexandria, for example, are unlikely to see a lot of combat. Typically, I'll use my navy to defend those rather than the actual garrison unit. But I'll give these 2 level 3 Defensive Doctrine guys to Hong Kong. Let's do this. Let's do this Western Desert Command now. We could assign this Trickster here if we want, but Offensive Doctrine is going to be a better trait overall, or even Logistics Wizards. Now we can do our mainline infantry divisions. Let's start with the ones up here, which are more likely going to be on the attack. And at this point, it's just a process of elimination. So we probably want to use all the rest of our Offensive Doctrine guys on these divisions. Also consider using maybe any engineers that we might want to train and get to a higher level, and same thing goes with Fortress Busters. So this guy would be a strong candidate. If I was planning an attack on one of the fort provinces here across this river crossing, I would try and put all of the Fortress Busters and engineers in that province. But having them mixed in here is probably not a bad thing. I'll leave these 2 blank for now. Let's put some. This core here is likely going to be mostly in defensive situations, so I can put some of my leftover Defensive Doctrine guys here. If you have a lot of leaders, I would not advise using the Skill 1 guys. In the case of the UK, we're not going to have a lot of good leaders until 1940, 1941. At this point, we're just using up any leaders that have decent skills that might later be useful. We do have a few leftover units that we haven't applied. So we've got the garrisons. I've also got these militia units that I'm using in Africa because they're good in low supply situations. I could use up these Logistics Wizards guys, but it's probably a better idea to simply put the highest skilled, no trait leaders. You'll notice that I've also created 2 naval HQs for the Home Fleet and the Mediterranean Fleet. I'll create one later for the Eastern or Pacific Fleet. For these, I'm going to use a Logistics Wizard with an Old Guard trait, and then we can just do our remaining garrisons, prioritizing Old Guards with the Defensive Doctrine traits. And then when I run out of Defensive Doctrine traits, I'm probably just going to use actually Skill 1 leaders. Only thing I forgot to do now is the Airborne Army. I have these 2 Gurkha divisions. Some ways it would be nice to use like a higher skilled Logistics Wizard, but just for kicks I'll use these commando leaders. They're not going to be useful elsewhere anyway, so I might as well save the Logistics leaders for areas where they're going to be a little bit more useful. So that covers off all of our land leaders. Keep in mind that this is a fairly subjective process. I've talked about some of the things you should be keeping in mind when you're organizing your leaders. But you could argue that, you know, some of these infantry corps would be better served by a high-skilled offensive doctrine leader or even a higher-skilled defensive doctrine leader. You know, it's basically up to you. The most important levels of the order of battle are going to be the army group and the army. And to some degree, making sure that you have decently high-skilled guys at the core level for reinforcement chance. At the divisional level, it's actually not going to matter that much. Let's do our naval and air order of battle. So, the Royal Navy here, I have a carrier task force with all my carriers grouped together, and I have 6 battle fleets. I'm going to want to put my best leaders on the largest fleets. I'm probably going to want to share them between my home fleet and my Mediterranean fleet. But generally speaking, you're going to want your best leaders, and it doesn't really matter what traits they have. What matters is their skill. So, let's put Cunningham in the carrier task force. We're going to put him to 2-star general so he can command 12 ships. And maybe we can put Somerville or Fraser for the first battle fleet, which is in the home fleet. Now I'll assign a couple of level 4 guys in the home fleet, and that leaves 3 solid skill 4 and 5 guys for the Mediterranean fleet. Not too worried about which traits they have. Mostly worried about the skill level so that I can reduce the stacking penalty. So Somerville, Bruce Fraser, and Mountbatten. Also have 2 reserve fleets which are meant for swapping out ships and also deploying new ships. Those reserve fleets can use old guards. I'm still going to choose a high skill old guard though, because if I do end up having to move these fleets, I don't want them to lose combat if they get intercepted. For submarine squadrons, quite simple. We're just going to use whatever Seawolves we have. In this case, we have 3 skill 2. I've got 1 submarine squadron in each theater. For transport fleets, generally speaking, if you have a shortage of leaders with traits, you're going to want to use old guards. If you have lots of traits, you could also consider using a blockade runner. In the case of the United Kingdom, I have the best of both worlds. I have an old guard, level 3 old guard with blockade runner. That means if this transport fleet gets intercepted, it will be able to disengage faster. And for something like a landing craft fleet like I've made here, I definitely want someone with the blockade runner trait. So let's take this level 3 blockade runner Ramsey. So that covers off the Navy. Let's look at the Air Force now. I have a reasonably small Royal Air Force for the time being. I've got more units in the production queue. RAF Fighter Command, I'm going to want basically the highest skill leader possible. Maybe a superior air tactician or a night flyer, but honestly, Tedder, Portal, or Harris might even be better leaders for this Interceptor 3 stack. I'll probably reserve them for bombers, though. So I'd say Leigh Mallory here with Superior Air Tactician, Night Flyer, and the skill 4. I would also consider, if I was out of leaders, I would consider using Park, even though he's an old guard, because air leaders tend to increase in skill very, very, very slowly. And so the fact that it's an old guard, it doesn't really matter. I'd rather use an old guard with skill 4 than a skill 3 guy with no traits. But we'll use Leigh Mallory because he's the best for now. I've got a fighter reserve here. If I was to divide this into 2 stacks, let's just do it for the sake of demonstration. Then I would pick probably Park. And I could pick Dowding, but I think Sholto Douglas is going to be a better leader. For the strategic bombers, it's a no-brainer. I'm going to pick Tedder, Portal, or Harris, a carpet bomber. Because they're night flyers, I'll also consider doing night strategic bombing runs, where I have the advantage. Tactical bombers it's a toss-up. If I'm going to use them for logistical bombing, I'm going to want to use a carpet bomber. If I'm going to want to use them for ground attacks, I'm going to want to use a tank buster. In this case, I would probably use these for ground attacks because my strategic bombers are going to be better at logistical bombing anyway. These transport planes, I would probably assign them an old guard or possibly just a leader with no trait. So I'll just pick this Barat guy. You do want to have a decently skilled leader. They're less likely to take more losses, but if you're short on air leaders, a level 1 leader, not a big deal. Last but not least, and do not forget, very easy to forget, your carrier air groups are going to be in your naval order of battle. You just click this plus button here. You can also see them. You can also see them by doing this, clicking this button. So here we've selected all of our carrier air groups. These are on escort carriers and these are on fleet carriers. You might want to consider using carpet bomber if you're going to be using your carrier air groups. I would use these for naval bombers. I didn't build any naval bombers this time around, but I might actually assign one of these guys to a carrier air group so that I can use that carrier air group as a sort of a port strike unit. And then the best trait's going to be Fleet Destroyer and maybe Spotter. Superior Air Tactician is also a decent trait for carrier air groups, although I tend to reserve those for my interceptor units. Also, this guy would be a solid contender as well, although I would probably put him on an interceptor unit since he's higher skill. So I'll just use up these level 2 fleet destroyers, and I have some left over. Because you're unable to build large stacks of carrier air groups, you're going to have a lot of different groups. So you're going to end up using some no-skill guys or some sort of lower-skilled guys on your carrier air groups. One thing I would do before pressing play here, before starting the war, is just promote my old guards to skill level 2. And that means if I create any cores, at least they'll have a leader temporarily before I can go and find them a better leader. If I'm going to put my leaders on auto assign, I also probably want to make sure that all the rest of my leaders are 1-star generals, so that they'll get automatically sent out to any divisions that pop out. So I'm just going to scroll down here and make sure that I don't have any 2, 3, 4-star leaders, and then these leaders will just get automatically assigned out to units as they come out of the production queue. And I'm going to turn auto assign on to make sure I don't forget. If I end up creating any armies later, I'm going to want to go to the army leader ledger here and find the best leaders. Take the best divisional leaders, so someone like Gord or Cunningham, and I'm going to want to move those up to the core army group level as I create higher levels of the hierarchy later. I don't tend to micromanage my divisional level leaders after I've done my initial choice of leaders. Unless I have a very specialized unit like a paratrooper or Marines or something that I'm going to be using in a particularly dangerous situation. So that sums up the leaders in the order of battle. Also gives you guys a refresher on order of battle as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Next video will be on land combat, and then I'll do air combat and naval combat as well, finally. Also remember that I do have a Twitch channel, and I will be playing Hearts of Iron 3 on that channel. Great place to ask questions, discuss the game, and, you know, I can do things based on requests or other things like that. Great way to have more direct access, direct contact. So it'd be a lot of fun if you guys came and checked that out. Once again, the Twitch username is rob_spot. So thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Ciao!